All right. Hello, everyone. This is the Ask Me Anything session with Shanelle Mullin. She is the Experimentation and Analysis Lead at Shopify, and she came to the community today to answer a few questions that were sent by our community members. So I've organized those questions, and this event's gonna be mostly about going through those questions. And to get started, I would like to invite Chanel to tell people a little bit more about herself and what is that consists her work as experimentation and analysis lead at Shopify. So welcome, Chanel.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks for having me. Hey, everyone. I'm Shanelle, and I am an experimentation and analysis lead at Shopify. So my day-to-day is kind of leading the Experimentation Center of Excellence. We're a strategy and ops team, and we're essentially just trying to add rigor and actionable results to all of the experimentation that's done at Shopify. And before that, I worked at CXL or Conversion XL, and I did content and growth there.
Wonderful. So most of the questions that we had are dedicated to Zero. There are a few questions about data and a few about content. So we're going to get started with the Zero so we can follow a little bit of a line of that. And then we're going to get back to the ones about content, okay?
Perfect.
So just to give a little bit of context for people who are not in Zero background and have just a very basic knowledge of what it is, how would you explain to someone that has heard very little about Zero what it consists of and what's the focus, the goals, and also the scope of the work of for a person working at Zero?
Yeah, for sure. No small task to define. It's quite a it's quite a wide field. I think that's what I like about it. I think about it as like the art and science of improving on improvement. Is how I tend to think about it. But it's essentially looking at whatever conversion rate you're dealing with, whether it's session to lead or add to cart, anything that you're looking to improve. It's kind of the method of going through research and ideation and implementation and then analysis and kind of feeding that flywheel. I think what's interesting about it is that people can approach it from so many different angles. Like you have people who kind of come from a copywriting background or someone who has more of a UX background or data science background and kind of just getting that T shape and that everyone is talking about. So yeah, I think it's kind of the combination of a lot of different marketing disciplines. For me, I approached it with more of like a content, unsurprisingly, a content background, kind of like the persuasion copywriting background, and then I've expanded out from there. But I would say that's how I got started. And I think anything that you can bring in, any skills you can bring in, or disciplines or backgrounds that you can bring in with the effort to improve or optimize a conversion rate is how I would define CRO.
And how about people who actually are hoping to get into the career, like they are generalist marketeers, and they would like to get started in a career in Zero? What are the skills and what were the steps to get in a position that is focused on optimization?
Yeah, I think you kind of nailed it in the question of like, I think what sets great CROs apart is having that generalist background and kind of whether you've gone deep into all of the different areas or not. I think it's just kind of having that understanding and that perspective is what makes CRO so interesting and seeing how all of the different disciplines fit together. So I would say kind of getting that breadth at first would be my recommendation. And then I'm a little bit biased, but I think probably going deep on analysis and analytics or data would be my next suggestion. But you see so much movement in CRO. People can go from being focused on optimization for paid or optimization for content. And I think the way that you do CRO is not necessarily important, but kind of having that foundational knowledge and the approach that you take with it.
About being multidisciplinary and having a little bit of knowledge on data and on copy and content. It's actually the whole idea about being a T-shaped professional. But then people want to know a little bit more about what's the technical side of it, and how do you master this part of more focused in analytics, about tools, the complicated part. How do you get started with that, and where do you start learning?
Yeah, good question. I think for me, like it's hard to give a specific answer because I think it depends on what exactly you want to do. But for me, the more technical side that I pursued after kind of starting with CRO was experimentation. So I
Mhm.
went super deep into statistics. I did a lot of that through textbooks. I just bought all of the math textbooks that I ignored when I when I was a student, and I read them. And then I also dove into SQL, and I'm getting more into Python now. So I think those three things would be what I would recommend if you were looking to get more technical with experimentation. I think a lot of people think experimentation and they think controlled A/B tests, and there's a lot of other measurement strategies that you can use. So getting familiar with simulated experiments, I think, is another one. Um, but I think another road that you could pursue is if you started with CRO and wanted to get more technical, you could go into like a CRO dev type role, which maybe you would want to learn like front end development, for example. So I think it really depends. I sometimes decouple CRO from experimentation. I think uh, they feel like two very different disciplines to me. So I think that's how I chose to get more technical from CRO. But there's a lot of different paths you could take.
And about the benefits of having an experimentation, what do you feel about when should a company start CRO and experimentation, about size, and is there any sort of industries that would benefit more about having a process like that?
Yeah, I think there is no certain size or industry for CRO. Um, I think you can start optimizing as soon as you have something to start with. So I always encourage people to kind of go through the conversion research process, which consists of surveys, both on-site and customer surveys. You can use heat maps, session replays, heuristic analysis, web analytics analysis. All of those things are very, very accessible, and kind of anyone can dive into them as long as you've had a web asset for maybe a month or two. So I think that's always super accessible, and that's what I like about CRO. I think experimentation is a little more tricky, just in the sense that I think there are some companies that won't get the value out of experimentation that they assume that they might. So if you are a really low traffic site, I would again encourage you to kind of focus on conversion research and conversion optimization that doesn't include experimentation. And I think when you're getting into experimentation, you can kind of start thinking through, how large are the changes that we expect to make. So if you're thinking that you'll see 20% changes or 20% positive or negative change, perhaps you can experiment with smaller sample sizes. Um, yeah, and so
From my
it's kind
experience,
of tricky.
it is. And there's no right or wrong answer. And then when you're, for example, for a company that is starting out and they want to focus in zeroing in on those things that can actually make a difference in their conversion rates, for example, what would be the ideal team to get started with that? Would you start with just one person that is multidisciplinary, or would you have more than one person involved?
Yeah. I think like the minimum you could just have one person who wanted to take on CRO. You'd probably need like a basic understanding of HTML, CSS maybe to make like the on-site changes yourself. At like mid-sized companies, you might want to also have a dev, potentially a designer as well, who can kind of work with them to make the changes that they want to make. And then at larger companies, we kind of got started at Shopify for growth with me in like a CRO role. There was someone who did kind of the experimentation side, and then we had a developer, data scientist, who are kind of
Okay.
helping out off the side of their desk. So I think it can look pretty different, a theme in my answers, but I think if you're really just looking to get started, you can do it absolutely with one person.
And how about getting insights? For example, I had a very basic experience with Zero. For example, I've tested hero images, copies on CDA buttons, a little bit of twinkling on the copy. But once you've done all the obvious things, like how do you get ideas to get more tests being run, or testing buttons, testing copy? How do you keep on feeding the machine with ideas?
Yeah. I'm a huge fan of starting with heuristic analysis. So I'll go through a website and I'm just looking for, where are the points of friction? Where is there a lot of distraction? Am I sure that my motivation points are actually motivating? Questions like that. I try to define a few principles as I'm going through. So I'm not just calling out my opinion, and then bonus points if you can get other people from other areas of the business involved. So that it's not just your point of view and it's people with different perspectives. And then I would typically fill that in with web analytics analysis. So I'd kind of get to like the what's happening currently on the website. And then I guess the step before that would be making sure that everything is technically working the way that you think it is. This sounds very straightforward, but a lot of people's websites are not working the way that they think that they are, or they are working the way that you think that they are, but you're just so used to using them that you don't see the ways that they're confusing or complicated. So assuming you've done kind of the technical analysis and the web analytics analysis, I would then move into more of the qualitative stuff. So I'd fill it in with that like customer survey, heat maps, session replays, form analytics, user testing, all of those things that we talked about a little bit earlier. And then typically from that, you'll have a long list of things that you want to look into, or potential test ideas, or things that are just broken and you should fix. And that's kind of the process I would go through to generate a whole bunch of ideas at once. And then hopefully your secondary ideas can come from the results of those first ideas. And you can kind of pull at a string instead of doing a lot of one-off experiments that maybe don't, or optimizations that maybe don't tell a story.
So you collect a backlog of ideas from multiple sources, either doing research for heat maps, or even from multiple people on your team, or even from the market. But then how do you, from all of this benchmark of ideas that you have created, how do you prioritize which ones are to be tested first, especially if you have limited resources?
Yeah. Well, as I said, I used to work at CXL, so I'm a proponent of the PXL prioritization model, simply because it takes in a lot of different considerations. And I think working at a larger company, I've realized how many considerations there are, and kind of how do you weight those different considerations against one another. So I like that it's very adjustable. Yeah, because it's like I think it's constantly like sometimes if something is just easy, it is worth shipping. I know Ronnie Kahavi has talked a lot about how sometimes some of the lowest effort experiments end up being large impacts, and it would have taken just a few minutes to ship it, but it doesn't end up getting prioritized. So that's always kind of top of mind for me. But I think that PXL with kind of like the weighted factors depending on your org's priorities and considerations, I think that's been the most effective model in my mind.
Cool. I think every company has follows a different kind of. There's a pie, there's an I score, but usually they go through just the difficulty and the impact, and those are sometimes they feel a little bit subjective. So every company should try and find a way to standardize and create a process to try to make a less kind of a feeling thing on how to prioritize your experiments. And also, I think you mentioned before having some sort of a library on the results of how you have tested, what you have tested in the past, and then using those as an insight to feed your experimentation process again. If that test has not worked, then why didn't it work? Was the idea bad? Did you need some alterations to maybe work in the past, to work in the future? So what you're looking at the past, and you're looking at your library of experiments, and then from there you can get insights into what to test next, and what things, what new ideas can come up from that past background.
Yeah, for sure. It's also super interesting when you do kind of build up that library or like an archive that you can look at what's working or not in aggregate, and you can look for the trends and the patterns, and how far off are your estimates of your minimum detectable effect or your detectability, and then when you're actually getting detectability, error rates, win rates. I think it's really interesting to be able to look back at that and use that to inform future experiments as well.
When you're managing multiple tests at the same time, how do you usually go about keeping a frequency on looking at how they are performing, and reporting to whatever stakeholders are expecting to hear about any sort of optimization improvements? How do you manage that? Is it like, do you guys usually do a meeting, or is it something that goes on in some sort of platform, and then you get informed internally through that? How do you usually manage the daily the daily process of experimentation and CRO?
Yeah, I think I mean, ideally, kind of a combination of both. Hopefully, whatever experimentation technology you have is kind of feeding notifications back into the businesses. But I think there was always going to be, or there should always be, that layer of analysis that happens at the end, and the interpretation of the results, and that kind of like manual conclusion. And I think ideally that's happening weekly, depending on the cadence of your experimentation, your optimization. If you're doing optimization and you're not necessarily using experimentation as a tool for optimization, I think that cadence or that frequency of check-in could get quicker than if you're waiting for longer experiments, especially if you're kind of early in maturity of the program and you're only running a few experiments per month, for example, or even per year. Obviously, you wouldn't have to check in quite as frequently.
Beautiful. So I had run some tests in the past that I've left them running for a little bit longer, and then initially it showed that, for example, variant B had a much impacted on a certain goal that I had in my website in a much more positive way than the variant A, for example. And then over time, this gap kind of flattened. So when you have a page, for example, that has a lot of traffic, a lot of people accessing it, so there's no lack of data, for example, because there aren't that many people using the page. How do you know when it is time to stop an experiment? When is it conclusive? Is there any type of rule in that sense, or not?
Yeah, there are situations when you kind of reach a level of maturity where you can think through when does it make sense to stop tests early. But typically, when you're just getting started, I would think through how long your test should run in advance of actually launching it. So we calculate, opportunity sizing, how large of an impact are you expecting, or how large of an impact do you want to be able to measure, and then we can use baseline data to figure out what the minimum detectable effect for that page or that asset is, and we can see how well that aligns with the opportunity sizing, and then we can choose a duration from there. Typically, we're looking for experiments that can run between like 2 to 6 weeks long. Any longer, it's typically just more exposed to all of those external factors that could come into play. People, if you're doing anything based on cookies, people deleting their cookies, holidays, and different validity threats like that. So I think that's one consideration. And then the other is that we also just may not be interested in something that takes longer than that to have an impact. Like, it might not be the highest priority question that we could be asking. So we would figure that out before we ran the experiment, because like you're saying, when you kind of look at the results as they're running, they're going to start out pretty wide, and they're going to shrink and regress back to the mean over time. So you're going to see, you often see, not always, you will often see larger results, and then they will slowly move back to the middle. So it can be misleading to peek at the results as they're running, and that's where like human bias tends to creep in. Like intuitively, very infrequently will people look at a positive result and say, let's keep it running, and make that decision. They'll be like, oh great, it's positive, let's stop it. So if you find yourself in a position where you're saying we should keep it running, it's likely your bias kind of sneaking in and trying to get that positive result that you're looking for.
Definitely. So I'm gonna move on to a few questions that have been sent by our users. So I'm gonna read out the question so you can understand a little bit more of the context of the question.
Sure.
So the question is, what do you recommend for someone with a software development background to go into what we call performance marketing? What is the best roadmap to follow to be as strong as possible in data analytics and performance marketing in general, including resources, course bootcamps, projects to strengthen their portfolio and get a job in the field?
Yeah, I'm a fan, like I said, for stats, I've been a fan of just kind of going through textbooks and reading through those. I think it's pretty accessible. There are a few courses that I've seen of just like Stats 101 that you could check out. And then I think when you get more into experimentation, I would suggest CXL Institute for that. I think I've taken quite a few of the courses myself, and I'm very passionate about it as a product. I think it's a great tool, and it's one of the few resources that I found helpful for not just beginners. So if you're like at an intermediate state, an advanced state of your career, I think that's a great resource. And then for web analytics, well, if you wanted to go for like languages or learning like SQL, Python, I found Treehouse pretty helpful in the past. For me, that's what I've been using. And then you can also I'm a fan of Juno College. They have a data analysis track that you could look into as well. So those would be like my specific course suggestions.
Wonderful. So another question. I'm starting out as a growth manager. This is my second month. I had a hard time choosing what to focus on and concentrated on getting it right. It is a jack of all trades grind. What do you recommend for people that are getting started as growth managers?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely suggest starting with that conversion research process. You'll end up with a great resource that people will be very interested in my experience. So I think it's a great way to get interest in CRO internally, and then kind of identifying the low-hanging fruit. And I know that's very vague. So like when I think about low-hanging fruit, I think about either the high volume, low value pages. So like a blog post that performs super well, like a content resource that you have, or your low traffic, high value pages. So, for e-commerce, that would be like your checkout page, for example. And those would be the two areas that I would focus on because, to the asker's point, there's just like so many places that you could start, and it seems like an unending opportunity. So those would be the two areas that I would focus that conversion research process on.
Lovely. There is something that we hear a lot when we're talking about growth and experimentation and also in CRO, is about failing fast. And there's a question here about it. So failing fast is something we hear about a lot. What are some strategies around marketing to use to fail fast before committing a lot of time to it? And I feel like there is a lot about that in CRO, but also on experimentation. can you tell us a little bit more about this failing fast sort of mindset and how we can benefit companies to try new ideas and not to actually commit that long of that much time or that many resources into something that could just be a test and be improved before actually rolling out to more users.
For sure. Yeah. I think like just generally, even taking a step back, I think the mentality of failing is super, super important. A lot of people approach CRO and experimentation with the mindset of if we don't win, we didn't get any value. And I think arguably all of the value in experimentation and optimization is in what you're learning and then how you can apply that and action on it for future smarter, faster testing. So I think just like creating a culture where failure is not looked at as a bad thing is really important. And then, once you can do that, kind of thinking about how do you fail faster and take more shots on goal to be able to fail faster. So I think that's part of it, of just increasing the frequency in which you're trying things is one. And then also, I think creating kind of lightweight experiments, whether like a controlled experiment or just something you're experimenting with. I know lots of times at different companies I've worked with kind of like smoke screen tests, almost, of like we advertise something to see what the interest is, and then we've like very rapidly built that service or that product based on the interest. And we started with 3 and we just wanted to see which would get the most interest. And then to that point, also just getting something out there. Initially, I worked on CXL Institute when it was launched, actually, and where that product started when we first launched it to where it's ended up today is a dramatically different product. And I think we could have spent forever thinking and hypothesizing and trying to get to the state it's in now, but I don't think that would have been as effective as kind of launching something and seeing what happens. So I'm not sure that I fully answered the question, but that's how I've kind of approached trying to increase the speed of failure.
That's how it goes. Shanelle, and how about, so there is a lot of failing involved with experimentation. Most of your experiments are going to fail, or at least not give you the results that you were initially expecting. How does buy-in for that kind of project is impacted by that sort of failing mentality and learning mentality? How do you educate and keep your C-level buy-in when you're talking about a project that has a lot of failings and the winning are the learnings? How do you go about that?
Yeah, I think part of the onus is on the experimenter or the optimizer to make sure that they are, if they're preaching that the insights and the learnings are important, that you're doing the work to connect those insights and learnings to the next action or the next level of impact. I think what you use that education for is the value, not just the education itself or the knowledge itself. So I think part of it is on the experimenter to frequently show people what that value is so that they can buy in. But I also really just think that having leadership buy-in is really important. If I were ever, looking to join a company to do experimentation, I would want to really interview the leadership team to make sure that there is buy-in for experimentation, because I think a lot of people say they want to experiment and they maybe don't. And I think like a level into that is like enthusiastic buy-in. Morgan Brown, when he came in as the VP of growth, it was a huge step change to just have like such enthusiastic buy-in for experimentation. And it's a very tangible difference. And I would say that's critical. I've written that it's critical so many times in articles, and I don't think I really realized how critical until maybe 3-4 years ago.
Yeah, it completely makes all the difference. Otherwise, if you don't have your C-levels supporting that kind of effort, then they're not really seeing the value or letting people give the time that is needed just to go through all the process and share the learnings and create ideas. because they're gonna be allocating into other tests, and it's not gonna be more of a balanced work assessment into allowing an experimentation to go on, even to create a core of people that are in their job description to run experimentation. But also when you have like a cross-functional team where part of the time of multiple people are allocated to experimentation and to CRO. So when you have that kind of buy-in and when you have that kind of support from your C-levels, then you can people working in the organization feel more secure about suggesting ideas because, well, your idea can fail, but then you're not going to just not suggest it because you feel like it might not work. It creates a culture where innovation gets a little bit hindered. So that's, in my opinion, uh, agreeing with you. That's it's just such a fundamental core thing, having your leadership support that kind of process.
Yeah. And
Moving
also,
on.
oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Darwin.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say, I think that kind of having that support and having everyone feel like they can contribute is really important. And then there's also that layer of investment to make sure that the experimentation optimization machine is working so that it is accessible for everyone in the organization to run experiments. I think is really important as well.
Shanelle, our next question is about A/B testing tools, and if they have any recommendations for people who want to do a little bit more of advanced stuff, not just stickering with prices or with images, but the entire page structure. And this person that sent the question just feels that Google Optimize feels sometimes a little bit basic. On that thought, just hold that thought for a second. I also want to know a little bit more about running multiple tests on the same page and how do you balance wanting to do a lot, wanting to test a lot of things with multivariate testing so that one test does not overlap with the next.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. I think if you're looking for something more advanced than Google Optimize, I would typically suggest VWO or Optimizely. Um, Optimizely, you'll notice a pretty big step change in the pricing, but I think VWO could be a good kind of like transitional one in between the two. And then in terms of concurrent experimentation, it's a really good question. Like when you think through it of, do you want to enable concurrent experiments, or do you want to, try to approach the same problem through multivariates? When you add more variations to something, you divide your traffic up more, obviously, and so you may run into issues of getting more neutral results. And I think often concurrent experimentation can be more valuable in that sense. But I also think everything is a trade-off. So if you were able to kind of look at what interactions you might be running into with having multiple experiments running, and kind of consider how they may interact with each other and how important that is or is not to you, I think that is also a very valid strategy. Like, for example, I would argue at most companies there is interaction between experiments, whether you have the email team running experiments that are then also interacting with web experiments, and then potentially are also interacting with ad level experiments that are happening. I think even if you were to control for interactions on the web level, you're still running into interactions and interference. So I think the most important thing is just being aware of what those interactions are and making sure that you're considering how important they are or how impactful they are to you or not.
Wonderful, Chanel. That's a great answer. When you're talking about, so you said you have a background more on content marketing, and I feel like this question is the perfect, this perfect interaction of your knowledge bases. So when you're talking about improving the conversions through tests with the landing page copy, uh, is there any way to gather ideas on how to test that copy in a way that actually makes an impact? And what is the right balance between the persuasion kind of side of things with your CEO and your keyword strategy when you're creating a copy that converts?
Yeah. I'm generally of the opinion that SEO should, in maybe the exception being like content assets, specifically like content marketing, but for your actual website and landing pages, I'm generally of the opinion that SEO should inform your strategy, but not necessarily dictate it. So often I'm thinking about like headings and metadata for SEO specifically, and then keeping that in mind as I'm writing the more persuasive copy. Um, and then I think in terms of what actually tends to drive impact for copy changes is anything to do with the value proposition. Um, Almost always I'll start by just like flipping it. I think that was Ollie Gardner who suggested that many years ago, and still I often find it very impactful. So if you have your heading and then your subheading, a lot of people put something more poetic in the heading and then put the actual value that you're giving in the subheading. So I find just like flipping those two can be pretty impactful. Of course, anything around the call to action and anything above the fold are just going to be more impactful. And then I think more specifically, I tend to take the Joanna Wiebe approach from Copy Hackers of doing voice of customer research. So in those surveys, in user testing, anywhere where you're actually interacting with your customers or with your users, I would try to take their language, if there's a pattern there, and kind of feed it back to them on the landing page. Um, that's probably been, in terms of like a theme or a pattern, that's probably been the most impactful copy experiments that I've run.
Great. Yeah. Usually, when you even when you go through a heat map, for example, the percentage of people who actually go through the second fold or third fold of page is just much smaller when you're talking about first fold. So usually, when I try to find things that are impactful, are usually tinkering with the copy on the first fold. Those are the ones that I find bring me the most impact. But I do like the ideas of testing, changing engagement and H2s, and those are very cool insights. Another question is if there is some kind of proven CRO methodology out there that could be adapted to any industry. And where do you start the CRO process? Do you start on the ads or do you start on the landing page, or those things don't have a particular order when you're starting your process from scratch?
Yeah, for sure. I think the most like general or applicable advice I could give is related to that conversion research process that we kind of walked through, and then starting with either the high volume, low impact pages like content assets, or the low volume, high impact pages like whether it's like a dedicated landing page or maybe it's your product page. If lead generation is pretty straightforward in identifying those pages. Um, but that's generally where I would start. And then I guess maybe the only other thing I would add is with the value proposition, um, and making sure that that's very clear, I think is usually the issue. If I were to look at a landing page and I was looking for one thing in particular, I think most people would say friction and I would say clarity. I think it's by far the most impactful thing to experiment with, maybe not experiment with, but to optimize for.
Uh, Chanel, could you like maybe contextualize when you're talking about running an experiment? Do you have anyone that stands out in your mind that you can give us as an example, for example, to explain the process for someone who has never worked with experimentation before? Where does the idea come from? How do you prioritize? Who is involved in setting up the experiment? For example, how did you decide whether or not it worked or not, and what was done with that learning after it ended? So, do you have any example to just create that idea in the minds of people who are watching us?
Yeah, for sure. So I think the ideation can really start from anywhere. It can start from that conversion research project that we talked about. It can start from people throughout the org presenting ideas. Some people I've seen have like a Google form, like a suggestion box almost, where people can just drop in ideas, or they can add it to a GitHub repo or anything like that. And then once you have some ideas, it would move into prioritization. So, you have a ton of ideas, and how do you figure out which is the most impactful or which is the most important to run first? Um, I would generally, like, when I think about impact, I'm thinking about what questions do we want answers to more than anything. Like I said, I kind of like to look at experimentation as pulling at a thread and try to answer some larger questions about the organization or about marketing, instead of kind of learning, this works or doesn't in this one specific case. Um, so I think that's a factor in prioritization for me personally. And then, like you said, most people are looking at it from like impact, um, you know, cost, effort, that sort of thing. So whatever your prioritization model is, you would apply it to all of the ideas. And then hopefully you would end up with your top ideas. And from there, hopefully you move to like a pre-analysis type phase. That's where we would calculate how long we want the experiment to run for, as we kind of walked through earlier. We would also get really specific with the hypothesis. I think another thing that will contribute to kind of building a culture of learning and valuing insights is making sure that your hypothesis will be valuable regardless of the outcome. I think that will also kind of help shift the mindset away from like, if it's not winning, that it's not important. So we try to design hypotheses in a way where whether you win or lose or it's neutral, you've learned something that you can take away. Um, so applying those, creating like an experiment brief of sorts so that you have documented what the treatments look like, how you're running them, how assignments are being made, where the experiments are running, like what the audience is, what pages it is. It's kind of annoying logistics, but I think it's very easy to forget all of these things when you're going back to analyze them later. Then we would run them, whether you're using Optimizely or VWO or Google Optimize. You would run them through your tool, and assuming they give you some sort of output or like a dashboard, it doesn't matter exactly what it looks like, but it should tell you the different conversion rates and how certain they are, depending on what type of statistical analysis they happen to use. And then we would do the post-analysis process. So looking into, is anything unexpected? Is there any errors that came up? Any anomalies in the data? Um, checking for sample ratio mismatch, checking for lift errors, anything like that would be the first step. And then we would kind of just step back and think, tying this back to the hypothesis, like what have we learned or not? What can we say for certain? And then we would work with maybe the marketing team or the PMs or whoever to figure out, do we iterate on this or do we ship it to 100%? Do we have follow-up questions that we want to ask in different experiments that are kind of following in this series? Or do we throw it out and start over? Hopefully not that one, but yeah, we would make a decision from there.
Wonderful. And when you're analyzing those results, you usually are going through some benchmarks. So people always ask, what is a good conversion rate? And I was wondering if you'd have any industry benchmarks that you could refer our audience to that are reliable and updated.
Yeah, I think there are some reports that will give you industry benchmarks, but I think my kind of hot take is that they're not super helpful, generally speaking. I think even just like at a company like Shopify, there are so many different baselines and benchmarks in the company itself. So it seems uh, really unlikely that a baseline outside of the company, especially in aggregate, would be helpful. I generally think that like a good baseline is uh, whatever your current baseline happens to be, and that a good conversion rate is a conversion rate that's better than it was before. So I think I just think it's not super actionable. Like I don't know what I would do differently knowing what the baseline is in the industry. Like I would still just want to increase my conversion rate. So I wouldn't, I guess my advice would be to not worry so much about how you're comparing to the aggregate industry data and just think about what's your current baseline and are you confident in the accuracy of that number? And then how can you improve that?
That's right. So your baseline is yourself and how your website is performing. So the idea is to go incrementally improving those numbers and having incredible different benchmark. Yes, it can be as you know that something is not quite right, but you shouldn't hold up yourself by running one or two experiments. You're gonna just surpass that standard in the market. So it's more of a slow process and small wins that will drive you towards or even surpassing any sort of benchmarks that you have in mind, right?
Yeah, I think the only other consideration is, I guess, if you did see a benchmark and yours was dramatically off of that, I guess it could be used to justify like a more innovative experiment or like a where you're changing multiple things. And but even then, I think it's still not incredibly helpful because if you do change a ton of things all in one shot, you still won't be able to extract those learnings of like what affected
No,
what.
what affected it
Yeah.
exactly. Uh, so, do you have anything else that you'd like to add regarding to CRO and experimentation, or can I move a little bit more to general marketing and content questions that were sent?
Yeah, that sounds great.
All right. So, one question is, when it comes to marketing, what are some specific must-haves that should be focused on at the start of a new brand or a new company?
Well, I'm very biased, but I would say content marketing is a great place to start. If only because it is like a longer investment. So the earlier you get started with it, the better. And it's also, I think, quite reliable in the sense that you can invest in it and you will see the ROI versus other platforms where maybe you'll see more up and down. If you're kind of like investing in it correctly, it should just be steadily up and to the right, depending on how heavy your investment is. So I would say content and kind of building out content assets would be where I would start. But I'm sure people with different backgrounds would have different takes. And then I would start with the conversion research that we've talked about of kind of going through the process for your own website and figuring out where the areas of opportunity are. Um, Maybe particularly with technical analysis and making sure that everything is working the way that you think it is. I think if you're just looking for the very basics, it should be, is your website working the way you think it is? And then do people have a way to organically find you would be the two questions that I would ask. Also, actually, maybe, sorry, I'm questioning myself. Maybe also something about the information architecture on your site. I think is a good place to start. Of say people do find you organically, and then they arrive. Do they know how to navigate to uh, the value that you
Where
offer?
you want them, yeah.
Yeah,
Where you want them to go. Are they able to find the steps to convert the way you want, either to sign up for a newsletter, to fill a form, to add something to their cart? So is there a way to get there?
right.
And is it easy to get there? So there's a lot of wins there, definitely. And another question is, hey Chanel, my product is a tech and outdoor escape room. I need some advice on ideas on content marketing. What would work? It's not a product, it's an experience we're selling.
First of all, it sounds like a very cool experience. I would like to do maybe submit questions to AMAs.
I've done a few. I'm quite a big fan. I'm a
Yeah.
fan of those.
I think though, I think content is a great direction because I know with experiences, there are so many different like lifestyle angles you could take with content. So I mean, of course, always recommend starting with keyword research and figuring out what are
Mhm.
people searching for to find similar types of experience. So kind of like competitor keyword analysis. Um, and then looking at what types of lifestyle content can we put out, whether it's, top experiences in X city or, you know, things for people who are really passionate about that specific genre of activity. Um, that's the approach that I would go. I think anytime you can take a lifestyle angle, it's great. Like you can't really take a lifestyle angle. People would disagree with me. It's harder to take a lifestyle angle with like plumbing, for example. But so when you have like a cool experience that you can market, I think that would be the direction I would take.
I think maybe even for group activities or company activities or even a gift for someone. I think an experience is a great gift to give a friend or to get your group of friends together to bond or your workmates to interact and to bond as well. It's maybe also related to the lifestyle and your different shopping situations that could be used to create content in that context.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. There is also a question that was sent here in the YouTube channel. So, Chanel, for a junior growth hacker that is interested in mastering the data analysis part, a data-driven approach, do you have a roadmap on what to learn before and how to apply your knowledge?
Yeah, for sure. I think for data analysis, I would consider what type of analysis you want to do. Like, for example, I do a lot of statistical analysis. So I kind of got that background in statistics. Very much a work in progress. It's a huge area, obviously, to study. So I think it depends on what type of analysis you want to do. But generally speaking, I recommend the analysis track at Juno College, and I've personally used Team Treehouse, I believe is the URL.com, to learn about SQL, Python, and different languages. I know some experimenters who have gone more heavily into R. So I think that also kind of depends on the company that you happen to work for and what languages they use. But luckily, it's pretty transferable. Like I think if you can pick up one, it shouldn't be too much of a stretch for you to pick up a similar one. So those would be the areas that I would focus on. And then in addition to just like the languages and stats, if that's applicable to you, I think learning how to interpret and make that data actionable is another one. And presenting that data is another one that I think is, in my experience, often missed from the courses that I've taken in the past.
Cool. And last but not least, Chanel, my team and I are creating a SaaS solution for Shopify merchants that aims to lower return rates. My question is, where can you find merchant communities? And what's your strategy when it comes to reaching those communities with your content?
That's a good one. I've always taken like a collaborative approach to my content. I think I've always reached out to experts or people in different communities to contribute to my content. And I think that's been really effective for increasing the reach of my content and then also in kind of creating inroads into those communities. So I think I did that quite often at CXL with some of my content of, if I wanted to get more into e-commerce, I would write an article on e-commerce and then I would reach out to people who are prominent in that community and ask them to contribute. And it honestly created a lot of networking opportunities. So I think that might be relevant. It might be a relevant approach here. And then otherwise, promotion seems like another one. But arguably the promotion will be better if you are part of the community. So I think also just like inserting yourself into the communities and making a name for yourself there without your content is another one. And then kind of adding that in as a layer on top of, oh, and I also create content that you might be interested in. Mm-hmm. So kind of, again, a longer play.
Right. So, Benesser, the person who has previously asked about how to learn more about data and how to be more data driven, he clarified a little bit more about his question. So
Sure.
he asked, I mean the growth related KPIs and metrics that leads growth, especially for SaaS companies. He's already a software developer, and he's also familiar with IT related things. So how can he learn a little bit more about data that is related more to KPIs and metrics of growth, especially specifically for SaaS?
Interesting. I think probably kind of looking through, I know Reforge has some great resources on the KPIs and funnel metrics that flow from SaaS. And so I would potentially start looking there. I think most SaaS companies are a little bit different, and then they all have um, well, they have some of like the basic metrics in common, like session to lead or session to customer. But I think beyond that, every company that I've worked for or consulted for has different KPIs and metrics, and they're queried in different ways, and they're defined in different ways, and they're using different data sets. So I think it would be a little bit hard to anticipate that. And so the only thing I would really recommend is kind of maybe looking at a resource like Reforge, and getting familiar with the marketing funnel in the linear sense. I know we all know that they're not as linear as we visualize them to be, but kind of getting familiar with that and looking at some of the more common KPIs. Um, but I really think that's probably something that you'll get more familiar with on the job. And if you have that foundational understanding of data analysis, that you should be able to apply it to most companies.
Vanessa, I hope that answered your question. Other than that, Shanelle, do you have anything else that you'd like to let the community know that about any resources or any final tips about how to get into CRO and also marketing and content and all jack of trades?
It's been a wild ride. Yeah, I don't think so. I've written a lot of articles on CRO and experimentation and content to an extent over the years. So if you want to check any of them out, I elaborate on a lot of this stuff. My website is ShanelleMullin.com, and it has like a huge list of all of the articles I've written. So that might also be a good place to get started. But other than that, that was all I had.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us today. We're going to be closing the broadcast, and we hope to see you again for our upcoming events, guys. Thank you so much for watching us.
Thank you.